myself. All right. So I hope you guys have enjoyed what we've gotten so far. We're on lecture number 3 of 6. And our next speaker is going to be Dr. Michael Powers, who's an assistant professor of the Department of History at Angelo State University in Texas. Michael, I want to welcome you, and we're excited to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled and humbled to be talking to you all today. Some of my favorite things in the world, of course, are New Orleans and particularly this 1884 World's Fair. So I'd like to thank the Friends of the Cabildo for inviting me. I'd like to particularly thank Jason Strata for organizing this wonderful event. And I hope to share with you guys a bit why I think New Orleans and this World's Fair in 1884 is so fun and fascinating. All right, so I'm going to try to get fancy and share my screen here. Okay. So, what I want us to start with is to situate New Orleans as a Gilded Age city
Before you
and
get
think
started, Michael, let's
about,
get the let's do the full screen. It did when you hit there, but it
I
didn't
see.
get going. Yeah.
Okay, try to do full screen. It's still not full screen.
No, if you go all the way down to the bottom right, next to that minus button, where you see 96, 95. I mean, it says 96, and then it has a little arrow. There's a little square thing right to the left of that minus button. Hit that right there.
I don't know if I see that.
Under the word universe, it says Angelo State University. Right under, all the way down to the bottom of the screen.
Okay.
Hit that.
All right. Let me start over with sharing.
That's okay.
So make it to 100%.
No, no, I'm just saying right to the left of that minus signal is the little PowerPoint, and that'll start your presentation. So share
Okay.
your screen. Share your screen again.
Okay.
And then on the bottom of your presentation, underneath where it says Angelo State University, basically underneath the U, right next to that minus button, you keep going a little left, left, left. That's it. Hit that.
So I have dual monitors. It's showing up on
Ah, that
either
might be what
monitor,
it
maybe.
is. Although it's not a problem at all. We can do with it. It's perfectly big. It's about 90% of what we want, so it's good to go.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Let's just roll with that. How about that?
that sounds great.
Okay. All right. So again, thank you all for having me. What I'd like to do as I talk about this fair in an international and transnational context is also to place it a bit more in an era that we might not think a whole lot about New Orleans, and that is as a Gilded Age city. So when we think about the Gilded Age, if we were to ask this question, we probably would think about, say, robber barons, Carnegie and Rockefeller, maybe Ellis Island, immigration, the Wild West, maybe big cities or political machines. But when we think about the South during the late 19th century, we might think about things like sharecropping or Jim Crow, or a region that's not as connected to that coming industrialization. So, in other words, the South too often is seen as set apart and distinct from the Gilded Age because that term Gilded Age often implies a northern focus. So I want to set up my talk then by demonstrating that New Orleans contains a lot of Gilded Age characteristics, and that we need to understand it as a Gilded Age city here in the middle of the 1880s. So first of all, New Orleans is an urban place, particularly for the South. In our time, when we think about large commercial cities, we probably think about Houston and Atlanta. But New Orleans was the largest city in the South right before the Civil War, the sixth largest city in the country, bigger than Chicago right before the Civil War. And even in the midst of our World's Fair era of the mid 1880s, New Orleans was still the ninth largest city in the United States, with over 200,000 people. Meanwhile, Atlanta and Houston, today's leading southern cities, would have less than 100,000. We can also see that New Orleans is pretty unique and very much like the Gilded Age with this era of immigration and the like, with being very fluid in its boundaries and how people are coming and going. So if we look to the south, New Orleans is the most significant southern city in the US at that time. But as far as international trade and movement and commerce, New Orleans is also the most significant northernmost city in the Latin American rim of the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. So, uh, likewise, New Orleans is very much a part of this Latin American nexus point because, along with San Antonio, New Orleans was a refuge for a number of prominent Latin American leaders, like the early leader of the Mexican Revolution. Uh, New Orleans was a hotspot for those exiles, particularly Benito Juarez, who lived in the French Quarter, and Mexico would gift New Orleans a bronze statue of Juarez that is today on the corner of Basin and Conti Street. New Orleans also has a lot of racial diversity, a lot of racial diversity as well. Shows us then that there were ethnic enclaves outside of northern cities, particularly French Creoles. The legacy of French culture and food in New Orleans is very strong. The French Opera House, pictured there, was the cultural hub of the city in the mid 1880s. But still a lot of significant Irish and German peoples, of course, in New Orleans that led the way. And Italian immigration in the 19th century is increasingly being looked at. And by the start of the World's Fair, there were about 20,000 Italian immigrants who called New Orleans home. That would be 1 in every 10 residents of the Crescent City. And adding to New Orleans' distinctiveness was that 90% of its Italian immigrants were Sicilian. Now, significantly higher than the, say, 25% of Sicilians that comprise Italian immigrants throughout the country. Now, while the Great Migration is still decades away, New Orleans also had a higher proportion of African Americans than most northern cities.
Michael, I
But
hate
there
to
were,
interrupt you, but you're going to have to, because of the way it's set up with the dual screens, you're going to have to hit the down arrow so the slides aren't advancing on our screen.
okay,
We're still on the original first slide. There we go. Yep. So that's the French
okay,
Opera House and
correct.
Tracy. Yeah.
Yes, so I'll kind of recap a bit. We talked about how when we think about the Gilded Age, we think of large urban cities. There's a depiction of Little Italy. And we think of the South, we might think of images like this of sharecropping and kind of poverty. But New Orleans was very much this vibrant city. This is a popular map of the city produced around the time of the fair. And then we talked about New Orleans as this Latin American entry point, particularly for exiles. And we'll see how the fair will really develop that. And here we are in the current slide. So everything's, you can see it now. Good.
Yep. All good.
All right. So New Orleans has also, as we'll see in the fair, a large Latin American connection that can be a bit overlooked. Outside of Texas, New Orleans had a higher proportion of Latinos than any other southern city in Louisiana outside of Texas than any other southern state. So the legacy of Louisiana's territory as a Spanish colony still remained really tangible. Even a prominent Louisiana Democrat in the 1870s, Louis Emmanuel Tejada, was the grandson of a Spaniard and still operated the family's plantation, fittingly named Castile. So at the time of the fair, New Orleans still boasted some Spanish language newspapers. Likewise, those big cities like New York and Chicago, because of that immigrant population and the Gilded Age, it's also known for a lot of Catholicism. And of course, we know that Catholicism is quite central in New Orleans. Well, if we think about these big cities, we'd also want to think about the Gilded Age, known for political machines and party bosses. We had earlier talks about that, how Edward Burke fits in there. So the Louisiana State Lottery Company was a key way that New Orleans is an embodiment of the Gilded Age writ large for its corruption and party politics. The Louisiana State Lottery Company is very different from, say, the Powerball and scratch off tickets from state lotteries today. It was led by a group of businessmen based in New York City. And interestingly, during Reconstruction, a decade before the World's Fair, Republicans approved a charter to create the Louisiana Lottery Company, and it was a monopoly. It was illegal to possess different lottery tickets other than the Louisiana State Lottery Company. So anyone who sold or distributed those could be arrested without a jury trial. When Democrats, like Burke and others, defeat Republicans, while they had been hostile of the lottery, they, instead of ending the lottery, take it over for their own purposes. So the lottery grows under Democratic approval, and Democratic officials enrich themselves on it the same way they had lambasted Republicans for. In other words, then, the lottery and the Democratic political machine were often one and the same with some blurred lines. So, as prior mentioned, a leading figure in Louisiana's Democratic political machine was Major Edward Austin Burke. He was a state treasurer, but he also was really the lottery's inside man in Louisiana politics. He would be the owner editor of the New Orleans newspaper, the Times Democrat, purchasing the newspaper in partnership with the president of the Louisiana Lottery. And one of the governors of the era in this time, Samuel McHenry, was ridiculed as McLottery by his critics for being on the puppet strings of that institution. So that set us up. Here's an image of Governor McHenry, Major Burke, and the rival Havana Lottery, which got people arrested just for possessing those tickets. But that sets us up to look then at the fair itself. We've placed New Orleans at the time of 1884 in a proper Gilded Age context. Let's explore the origin and meaning of 19th century fairs. So international expositions in the 19th century can be likened to today's Olympic Games. They're international affairs that allow nations to display their premier talents under the auspices of cooperation and goodwill. 19th century World's Fairs and today's Olympic Games also see their hosts crafting elaborate ceremonies and structures to legitimize political authority and celebrate a cultural distinctiveness. So, a highly contagious World's Fair fever began with London's 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition and ultimately would yield over 100 expositions in the next century. So millions of people are attending World's Fairs, like in New Orleans, all over the globe, and they gaze at a myriad of displays ranging from technological wonders like incandescent electricity to engineering marvels such as the Eiffel Tower. So these World's Fairs then function as kind of cathedrals of cultural and political authority. And they're also waypoints of change that affected people's daily lives and serve to define what they see as modern and their perceptions of the world. So the 1884 New Orleans Fair joined other American expositions in the era in actively creating and spreading a new novel American culture that exalted capitalism and consumerism as ethical and progressive. So even in these natural environments where moss covered live oaks are on the New Orleans Exposition grounds, these are furthering the American ethos through awe and spectacle of those steam engines and other modern events. So the World's Fair then brings modernity into popular culture by presenting industrialization and commerce as amusements and attraction. And along the way, they spread the political, economic, and cultural authority of the organizers and leaders. So men like Edward Burke are kind of furthered in their power through their leadership of this fair. So the soil for such a World's Fair would prove very fertile in the famously libertine Great Southern Babylon that is New Orleans. So the New Orleans World's Fair in 1884 would begin in December, but when a national official first arrived in New Orleans a couple months before the fair opened, so this is October of 1884, he noted that the Crescent City was, quote, wild with delight and bustling with the craze of the coming exposition, end quote. He found a city brimming with confidence and anticipation of showing off the cultural qualities of New Orleans, and of course, eager to seize the opportunity to make money in the process. Writing from his room in the St. Louis Hotel, this national official who represented the Smithsonian said the city's mix of hospitality, bluster, and zeal for profit was immediately fitting. He said, quote, "It may be truly said of New Orleans, what a country and what a people. St. Paul, Dwight L. Moody, or Ben Butler would indeed find a rich field for missionary labors," end quote. So the official name of the World's Fair, of course, was the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition. And I argue that supporters of the fair hoped to use it to accomplish several things. First is reconciliation between North and South. Second will be industrialization and commercial capitalism. Third is a under acknowledged aspect of the fair is how the World's Fair in New Orleans is really a key turning point for the Smithsonian Institution of all things. So we'll look at that thirdly. And then last, the World's Fair is a watershed moment that increases the South and New Orleans and Louisiana in particular, their trade with Latin America. So this is the first major World's Fair in the former Confederacy. The tying this together with it as an example even of kind of the political machines of the Gilded Age, the Director General is Edward Burke, and the largest monetary contributor donating funds to the fair was the Louisiana Lottery. So the World's Fair functions with a lot of reconciliationist goals in mind to try to lessen sectional tensions and boundaries just 20 years removed from the terrible Civil War. So, exposition planners and exhibit directors took great pains to shape the perception of the former Confederacy as a region that had renounced slavery and secession. New York minister Thomas DeWitt Talmage, one of the nation's leading orators and longtime newspaper editor, beseeched the Almighty in the opening day ceremony's benediction that the exposition would not only wash away, quote, the last feeling of sectional discord between North and South. In a written speech read ahead of the opening, President Chester Arthur hoped the pursuit of increased commercial ties with the world by like-minded businessmen from all over the United States would help prove, quote, motives for strengthening the bonds of brotherhood, end quote. So as these pictures indicate, symbols of American nationalism were everywhere. A big symbol of American patriotism and unity before our modern pantheon of monuments on the National Mall. So before, of course, the Washington Monument or all these other statues that embody American patriotism today. One of those prominent ones was the Liberty Bell. So exposition leaders successfully convinced Pennsylvania to loan the famous bell to the New Orleans World's Fair. This was actually the first time in its history that it would leave the city of brotherly love. In a fascinating paradox demonstrating reconciliation, there was a famous Confederate unit from New Orleans, the Washington Artillery. They fought to break up the United States, but at the World's Fair in 1884, they would escort veterans of this regiment, would escort the bell to the exposition grounds. And we can see in this image that Philadelphia and New Orleans, these central cities in the North and South, respectively, we have an image there right on the train of them shaking hands in cooperation. Later fairs held in the South would emulate and copy New Orleans, and they would bring the Liberty Bell back below the Mason-Dixon line. The architecture and layout of exhibits also accomplished the effect of reconciliation. Every state had an exhibit in the US government building. So under one roof, residents could visit, say, the seedbed of abolition in Massachusetts, that state exhibit, and the seedbed of secession in South Carolina. American flags, as we see, draped the interior nearly as thick as the Louisiana humidity, and the diversity of guests that were very prominent and made the news show us as well the effects of reconciliation. Julia Ward Howe, an abolitionist and women's suffrage advocate and author of the Union anthem Battle Hymn of the Republic, she's at the fair, and Jefferson Davis tours it later as well. And during the era of Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, there was a very famous political cartoonist, Thomas Nast, and he would create a couple cartoons about the New Orleans Fair. And he demonstrated that the fair would bury issues of national unity. So this image really is mocking the fact that some Republicans had suggested that the return of a Democrat to the White House with the recent election of Grover Cleveland in 1884, that it might revive Southern attempts for slavery and secession. But Nast wrote this cartoon that cast such fears as an absurd, quote, cock and bull story. So we can see two prominent Republicans who we would have recognized if we were attuned to politics or living in the 1884 at that time. We can see two prominent Republicans leading a foolhardy charge under a banner of hate and malice towards the New Orleans exposition that is topped with the American flag. Nonetheless, though, some still worried that unresolved hostilities between North and South might boil over at the fair. A group of Pennsylvanians opposed loaning the Liberty Bell, and they expressed concern that if Louisianians gained temporary control of the Liberty Bell, they might melt it down and either cast a statue of Jefferson Davis with it, or somehow that the Louisiana Lottery might steal it and offer the bell as a gambling prize. So, Century Magazine, a national magazine, was present, its journalists were present at the fair, and they included an article that at one moment, a few Southern visitors in the cheer were heard giving hisses to the unfurling of the stars and stripes at a fair event. But the Times Democrat wrote hastily to say no such hissing occurred. That was directed at the American flag. So public spaces was carefully created to present this image of reconciliation with modernity. To make certain of patriotic effect and expanded attendance, exposition management would often devote particular days to individual exhibits that they believed might operate as public displays of civic boosterism and national unity. Georgia Day was really typical of such events. Southern commissioners and state representatives routinely espoused national accord, as did a Georgian who professed, quote, no heartier gratification than to see the states of this union meet beneath this ample roof, end quote. A Georgia senator received raucous applause when he patriotically predicted, quote, the exposition may be the means of binding with closer ties the people of this great union, united by the common and glorious flag. There is no south, no north, no west, no east, but one land, one country, one nation, now and forever. And the Liberty Bell yet again comes into play. It served as tangible proof of regional reconciliation, as the Georgia delegation, along with federal representatives of the U.S. government, would pose for a photograph in front of the Liberty Bell. Moreover, the New Orleans Exposition was a significant step in the growing popularity of Civil War veterans reunions, as aging Union and Confederate veterans participated in a 1,000-man march for Veterans Day in 1885, and during that ceremony, a Connecticut Union regiment returned a captured rebel battle flag to its former Mississippi foes. Prior fairs, like that in Philadelphia, the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, former Confederate states participated little at that one. But as the first major fair hosted by a Confederate state in New Orleans, and it was also the first federally sponsored fair after Reconstruction, the New Orleans Exposition was this big watershed moment for reconciliation. So later fairs would copy New Orleans, showing us the lasting impact of the New Orleans Fair. Later fairs in Atlanta and Louisville and in Virginia would hold similar blue and gray days that had a lot of reconciliation rhetoric. Yet another emphasis and goal of the fair, of course, is for industrialization, because frequent displays of reconciliation often went hand in hand with trying to draw northern capital as a means of furthering industrialization of the South and the South's share of commercial markets abroad. So the New Orleans World's Fair was a means to try to demonstrate to a national and international audience that the South, with New Orleans as its linchpin, was in step with industrialization and modernity. Nothing was more modern than electric lights and the Edison Company. The Edison Electric Light Company provided the 15,000 incandescent electric lights in the fair's main building, and it illuminated 33 acres under its roof which was touted at the time as the largest building in the world if we measure it by covered area. So the fair is for when many people see electricity for the first time. Intentionally expanding upon the defining French influences of the Crescent City, a Swedish born architect would design the main building after the Louvre's imposing towers and elegant arches. Going back to electric lights, the fair grounds itself were lit by 10 of the most modern forms of outdoor electricity at the time, massive 170-foot tall light towers that singularly displayed 25,000 candle power. So evening strolls along these illuminated paths in the row of live oaks in today's Audubon Park was a favorite activity for romantics in the evening. So all of these really do much to link the New South with tangible manifestations of industrialization and progress. So Southerners then are fashioning miles of ordered rows of abundant natural resources within these fair buildings and the latest technologies to present a sense of control and authority and modernization to the public. We now can turn towards the Smithsonian's participation, but before we focus on that institution, we can explore the federal government's support of the fair. The 1884 exposition was the only federally sponsored fair in the decade and only the second nationally sponsored international exposition following Philadelphia's earlier one that I mentioned. So no wonder then that it received a significant amount of government support to ensure that it fostered the national interest. New Orleans Exposition also has an institutional legacy. It would set the standard for the federal government's organizational structure for future fairs. President Arthur accomplished this with an executive order in 1884 that retained the personnel and structure of the federal fairs who organized the national government's displays for later Southern expositions in Louisville and in Atlanta. So when we look at the Smithsonian's participation, we can find that this fair was a seminal event in the proliferation of education and knowledge. Indeed, 19th century World's Fairs were the incubator of the Smithsonian as we know it, with its emphasis on research and museums. New strategies for the organization, the form, the style, and the presentation of public scientific displays were first given a trial run at World's Fairs before finding their ways to the museum halls. As a means of diversifying and expanding the Smithsonian's collections at low cost, the Smithsonian often would acquire displays from fair participants in both the private and government sectors.
Michael, we may be a little behind on slides again.
I'm still on this
Oh,
one.
okay. I just wanted to make sure. Okay, no, sorry about that.
No problem, no problem at all. So Smithsonian leaders were very eager to use the fair to draw attention to their brand new building on the National Mall. The first ever Smithsonian building is the U.S. National Museum. It opened in 1881. Today it's known as the Castle. So the New Orleans World's Fair is the first World's Fair to occur after the Smithsonian now has a brick and mortar museum. So Smithsonian officials aimed to comprehensively display a lot of American wildlife and other resources. So to prepare for the fair, all throughout the summer of 1884, Smithsonian officials scouted and collected animals from the Dakotas and Texas and throughout the country. They considered the New Orleans Fair, quote, an unusual opportunity to explore more distant regions and yield new species or species yet unrepresented by the Smithsonian, end quote. So once the fair opens, the New Orleans Exposition was a big turning point in those modern museum displays. The Smithsonian's anthropological exhibits at the 1876 Centennial in Philadelphia really consisted of a lot of artifacts stuffed into glass cases. Yet the public kind of gave some feedback that they were mostly confused or even bored over them. But it was at the New Orleans Fair that Smithsonian officials really fine-tuned modern exhibit displays by having a more minimalist philosophy that emphasized clarity and quality over the number of artifacts. So at the New Orleans Fair, the Smithsonian eliminated duplicates and instead selected, say, one ideal specimen of each display type that matched a detailed and instructive label. And at the World's Fair in New Orleans, we see a durable partnership between many Smithsonian officials who would go on to use that partnership and represent the Smithsonian at nearly half a dozen other World's Fairs throughout the world. Lastly, the New Orleans Fair also strengthened reciprocal links across the boundaries of the US South and Latin America. In his aforementioned written speech ahead of the opening of the fair, President Arthur acknowledged that an international exposition in New Orleans, quote, situated at the gateway of trade between the United States and Central and South America, would promote a profitable intercourse, end quote, between the US and her southern neighbors. So, with the United States linked as never before by railroad, steamships, and telegraph lines, Arthur hoped that the exposition would engender, quote, goodwill and peace between all nations while advancing the material welfare of all. So, a seminal aim of this World's Fair in New Orleans was a concerted effort to increase the international stature and commerce of the New South, with New Orleans explicitly leading the charge. This element of the fair was most salient in regards to Latin America. The economic hardships of the South after the Civil War were evident, and we can see that historians have long demonstrated that New Orleans and the South often eyed Latin America before the war in the antebellum period, but after the war, the fair shows us that Southerners maintained a particular focus on Latin America. So, Director General Edward Burke's remarks during the fair's Louisiana Day show how he used national reconciliation coupled with a proclamation of Southern industrial and commercial advancement as justification for Louisiana to lead the drive for deepened ties with Latin America. Quoting Burke here, he said, quote, sitting at the foot of the Mississippi Valley, New Orleans stands ready to uphold the banner of American commerce to the friendly shores of our neglected neighbors southward, ready to extend a hospitable welcome to the people of all the world and to prepare for her proud destiny as a mistress of the American Mediterranean and the share in the commerce of the Orient. So 17 foreign countries and colonies were represented in New Orleans. 6 of them were from Latin America. The largest presence of any foreign country at the fair was unquestionably Mexico. Mexico would go on to fashion a renowned presence at later World's Fairs, yet the New Orleans exposition set the mold. One historian of Mexico called the New Orleans Fair, quote, without question, the first major effort for Mexico to portray itself as a modern nation on the world stage. Mexican President Porfirio Diaz used the fair both as a means of strengthening his own power and to court foreign capitalists. So, to make this happen, 2 Mexican buildings were constructed on the grounds, which, coupled with some additional Mexican displays in the main building, provided visitors with 76 acres dedicated to Mexico. Architects built an impressive octagonal building pictured here, dubbed the Mexican Alhambra, to house mineralogical exhibits that blended Spanish and Aztec designs with steel and glasswork. Diaz himself, President Diaz of Mexico, courted Southern capitalists when he and his new wife visited the fair as a stop on their grand tour of the United States. Later on, I'm sure we'll have a fascinating talk about the cavalry band from Mexico, known as the Mexican Band. They were another successful influence. So, some remarkable pictures showing the importance that Mexico placed on this building when they built it in New Orleans. Going back to this next slide, they built it in New Orleans and it was a big hit, and it was so popular that President Diaz had it disassembled, returned to Mexico City, and put back up. So if you ever find yourself in Mexico City, you can see with your own eyes a relic of the World's Fair of New Orleans in 1884, because there it is in Mexico City today. Pretty remarkable. Well, Mexico wasn't the only Latin American country to have a noted presence at the fair. Central America was also involved. With the motto of Paz, Progreso y Caminos, Honduran President Luis Bogran marshaled his country's energy and resources towards a prominent place in the New Orleans Exposition in order to attract capitalists, particularly in Honduras's blossoming mining industry. According to the director of Honduras's national display, a German immigrant and metallurgist, Dr. Reinhold Fritzgartner, ambitious men from Honduras who did not, quote, favorably impress attendees of the important and glorious event in New Orleans risked missing a major opportunity to lure American capital and labor. So Honduran President Luis Bogran used the fair to attract investors, as we mentioned. And one such person who received a lucrative mining contract in Honduras was Major Edward Burke, who had lived there following his political defeat. So unquestionably, the fair did have its struggles. The occasion of the fair, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of America's first cotton shipment and congressional funding, mandated that the fair open before the calendar year of 1884 ended. That meant that when the fair opened in December, many exhibits were not yet fully complete, and the fair opened prematurely. As if transportation issues and construction delays were not enough, torrents of continual rain added to the woes. So the weather in New Orleans and the environment became an obstacle. The downpour that happened for weeks led many in the working at the fair to call New Orleans Mudville. Another exposition worker remarked that many Crescent City streets, quote, did not seem to have any bottom when wet, end quote. That all seems familiar to us. If we ever see a pothole with water in it, you never know quite how far your tire is going to go down in it. This same worker would tell a loved one up north that, quote, you don't know anything about mud until you come to New Orleans, end quote. During this cycle of rain, the main building acquired a leak, and that in this rain, the exposition really suffered with a lot of attendance, finally rounding the corner, though, by February of 1885. One of the leading Smithsonian officials said that the weather finally had, quote, satisfied its spits against the city, end quote, and that now the fair was attracting visitors from all parts of the country. And this national Smithsonian official would say that the fair was, quote, a mammoth affair and unquestionably the finest exposition of America's resources and industries the world had ever seen, end quote. Now, despite representing this New South vision and aiding in sectional reconciliation, if we're defining the fair's success as a financial success, it doesn't match up. The national economic downturn, a premature opening, and other aspects meant that the fair did not turn a profit. A socialite from Washington, D.C., summed up the fair when she stated that it proved a great success, except in finances. Nonetheless, the New Orleans Exposition spurred 6 more World's Fairs held in the South. That in total helped foster significant advancement of Southern industry and commerce to support a New South vision of a renewed and more vibrant role in the wider world. So if we look at it nationally, it's a big turning point. If we look at it locally for the city of New Orleans, it's a major event with the development of areas around Tulane and Loyola, and of course today's Audubon Park, and for leaders like Edward Burke, who would gain that Honduran mining succession when he's kicked out of office. It would be a big role as well. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. I'd be happy to welcome any questions that you may have.
Perfect. Thank you. Michael, you said that the original intent of the World's Fair was to change the kind of the U.S. perspective or the world perspective of New Orleans. Um, do you feel that it did do that and it was successful in doing that?
I think it's significantly added to the perception that the South as a whole was over slavery and over those sectionalisms that had really defined it. So I think it also convinced many throughout the country that New Orleans was poised to transition from mostly this trading port of cotton and import and exports along the Mississippi that had defined it and made it so prominent in the antebellum period before the Civil War. I think that the fair helped many investors realize that industrialization, railroads, and manufacturing could come to the city more frequently, as well as New Orleans with steamships. They're pretty close steamship routes to other parts of Latin America. So I think if we look at the success of the fair along convincing people throughout the world that New Orleans has moved on from sectionalism, that it's now ready for modernity, I think it was a success.
I mean, do you also think that this was a way for also the South to be seen in that way as well? I mean, yes, the United States in general or New Orleans, but the South was seen as this economic hub that had taken a break from us, but now had turned a corner into becoming much more useful, or come back to being, or maybe
Yeah.
even changed a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. But one thing that I kind of hinted on, perhaps if I didn't say it too directly, is in the late 19th century, a lot of these individual Southern cities are competing against each other.
Hmm.
And in general, when folks and historians tend to think of, quote, the New South, the city that comes to mind is Atlanta
Yeah.
and proponents like Henry Grady. So the number of books devoted to the New South tends to focus on Atlanta and maybe Virginia, the Carolinas. And I argue in my own work that if we're talking about the New South, a New South zealot who is overlooked is Edward Burke himself, but that New Orleans, just as a city and Louisiana as a state, deserves more focus as embodying the South as a whole and as trying to lead the South. So I guess to answer your question, yeah, definitely is an attempt for New Orleans to see itself as the South and lead the South.
And do you think that I think you said that there were six Southern World's Fairs after New Orleans?
Mm-hmm.
um, that was that without New Orleans, you're not going to see that many World's Fairs in the South. And the perception was, okay, look what they did, how successful that was, and we got to do our own thing as well.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it. The New Orleans Fair spurred that other people wanted their moment of fame and their time in the sun, and so Atlanta rushes to have a fair, and so does Louisville and other southern cities.
Just to go back to kind of a little technical thing was the Liberty Bell.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that absolutely amazing. I think we've had lectures before where they've talked about that, but the the idea that you're going to bring the Liberty Bell thousands of miles in the 1880s down here, it had to be symbolic
Hmm.
for the New South, for New Orleans in general, that this American unifying item was brought all the way down here 20 years after the Civil War. Do you think that was the complete reason why they did all that? Or is it more of just because it's harder to go see it, to travel back and then, or do you think it's that it was another perception kind of thing that they were trying to make?
Yeah, I think the entire reason of getting that Liberty Bell was to tangibly let Americans see that the Liberty Bell is now, in the heart of Dixie in many ways.
Hmm.
And so I think intersecting with a lot of that is the World's Fair here in New Orleans takes place after Reconstruction. It's in an age where white Southern Democrats, many former Confederates, are now holding power. So it's also, of course, history is important for not just what is said, but what is not said. While there is a department for Black American participation, these elements of reconciliation are attempting to reunite the country, North and South, by means of burying racial divisions and really kind of moving past um, a lot of commitments to Black rights and liberties. that is an unfortunate aspect of that reconciliation.
And it's interesting for for them to kind of be that forward thinking on
Mhm.
that subject, but also at the same time, then you have somebody like Edwin Burke, who was a well-known, white supremacist, and is in the Confederate Army, was a major, but at the same time, they were like, we got to do this because we have to give this perception. And I think that's an interesting way to kind of look at them and say, obviously, they had a lot of negatives about them, but they also thought about this as well and tried to make it that they realized that it was much more just not, hey, we're just going to put this here and call it a day kind of thing. It was that they had to think of it strategically.
Yes, yes, yeah, for sure.
If anybody has any other questions, please put them in the chat. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the lottery.
Yeah.
Is the reason that they use the lottery is because you can mask? I mean, you can sell lottery tickets and people buy them, and there isn't basically, and I'm sure in 1884, I mean, even today, I mean, who knows how much accounting is done? I'm sure that they have audits and all that stuff like that. But the use of that was for a reason, right?
So yeah, the lottery is again intertwined with Louisiana and New Orleans' political machine that was known as the Ring, kind of colloquially. And the lottery, the Louisiana lottery, because of the telegraph and because of the national mail and railroads, Louisiana lottery was actually sold nationwide. So it was one of
Okay.
the most popular lotteries throughout the whole country. And the face of the lottery, who was up there holding the drawings, many of you viewers probably are familiar with, was PGT Beauregard. He was
Mhm.
the public face of that lottery. So the lottery is a really fascinating and I think on the whole a bit understudied aspect of Louisiana history. That also goes transnational. When Burke and others lose the election in 1888, they go to Honduras, and the lottery actually moves to Honduras with them by about 1900. So
Oh, well, that's a fascinating
yeah,
little piece of history right there.
yes, that's right.
Um, All right, great. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Powers, so much for speaking today. I thought that was an absolutely fantastic presentation. And we're going to take a short break. I mean, not short, we're going to take about a 45-minute break so you can go get lunch. It's right past noon. So we're going to start back at 12:45 with Dr. Charles Heath. And we're going to do one more 1884, and then we're going to get back into some more 1984 and 1884 comparisons as well. So um, Michael, I want to thank you so much for presenting today. We really appreciate it. And we will see everybody back. You can just leave your screens open. And as we get closer, I'll put everybody back in the waiting room as I get Dr. Heath in there. But you can just leave your screens open, and we will see you guys in a little bit. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We appreciate it.